Hello, and welcome to Groundbreakers with Charles and Alice Dagit. I'm Alice. Groundbreakers is a show about the history of American architecture and specifically how it's been molded by the American dream, the American character, which simply bursts with ingenuity and invention. Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings and they shape us." Our culture and very way of life are embodied in our buildings. The way we live in houses and work in offices, the way we recreate, all are influenced by the buildings we use. Design informs everything we touch and experience. We will experience the ways in which architects and their designs have been molded by our culture, our economics, our environment, our social and political fabric. We'll be going from place to place through an architectural and historical timeline to show how these influences indelibly shaped the architecture we have today. This is the American story of the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that has created our architectural treasures. We hope that, as you walk around your towns and cities, you will look up with renewed curiosity and ask, how come? We have with us award-winning architect Charles Dagit, who holds Pennsylvania's coveted Gold Medal of Distinction. A member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, Charles has won over 60 national, regional, and local design awards, and he has written a fascinating book on this very subject. Welcome, Charlie. And why don't you tell us how that book came about?
Okay, the book came about,
To me.
it's called The Groundbreakers, and it's architects in American history and their places and times. And it came about because I was very active in the AIA National Committee on Design. And I joined that committee quite some time ago. And one of the meeting places that they decided on was to meet in Annapolis. And I'm a sailor. And so I organized at the same time a sailing trip for the committee. And people joined us on a 3-day sail of the Chesapeake. And because I'm a sailor, the chairman of the committee at that time came to me and said, well, you're a sailor, you must know the architecture of Annapolis. And knowing absolutely nothing about the architecture of Annapolis, I said, what do you need to know? And he said, we'd like you to do a lecture on Annapolis architecture. And you could put what I knew about Annapolis architecture on the head of a pin. And that led to a 6-month research project. And that research project led me to some really interesting and fascinating discoveries about architecture in America. And what I learned, because it was going to be the architecture of Annapolis, I learned about the colony of Maryland. And I began to get a notion that there was a complete distinction between the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. The interesting thing that I found was that Sir Francis Nicholson was the man who laid out both cities of the two states, Williamsburg and Annapolis. And I began to look at the culture of the people of Maryland and the culture of the people of Virginia, and I found it fascinatingly different.
How so?
The Virginians are landed gentry, and they are fiercely loyal to the king and to the Church of England. As a matter of fact, the Virginians threw all of the Quakers and Catholics out of Virginia because they wanted to just promote the Church of England. And it wasn't until Thomas Paine decided that the throne and the Church of England were not a really good idea. It wasn't until then that the Virginians changed their mind. The people of Annapolis were quite different. They were mostly Catholic because of Lord Baltimore, who helped to settle Maryland. And while they had plantations, they were actually much more different than the landed gentry because they were mostly traders and merchants living in Annapolis. And I found the contrast between the two cities really pretty fascinating. And the fact that Sir Francis Nicholson laid out both cities also was intriguing, because I looked at the plan of those cities and realized that they were entirely different. And how does a man who is laying out these cities know? What does he know to make them so different? And he makes Williamsburg a English parade ground town. And I would say the town layout is almost medieval. Some people say it's Renaissance. He makes Annapolis Baroque, like Rome. It's got splays of streets and stuff. You'll see on the screen the town overview is really quite bizarre. And it's Baroque because they're Catholics. And also because they're traders and merchants and nouveau riche, as opposed to the stately Virginia landed gentry. So then I began to look into the architecture of Annapolis, and I discover a couple of really interesting buildings. One is Bladens Folly, and the other is the State House. And they are quite rich in ornamentation. And Bladens Folly is the largest building in Maryland at the time. The man who created it, Bladens, was governor of Maryland at the time, and went bankrupt over the building of the house.
Whoa.
The State House is very rich in detail, and as opposed to the architecture of Williamsburg. And Williamsburg is very stiff. And for instance, if you look at the governor's palace, it's very taut, not embellished at all, and rather cold. And
kind of formal? Kind of formal?
Very formal. And the houses, the Williamsburg house, the Bafferton house, other Williamsburg houses are all taut and very stiff, and very little ornamentation. And
where did they get the inspiration for those buildings?
Well, the most of the influence of the buildings in Virginia and in Annapolis came from the British. And the British had a large treatise of various observations about architecture that were passed on to the Americans. And there were also, at that time, what are called pattern books. And the British promulgated a number of different pattern books, and it taught you how to carve a mantle and a doorway and so on and so forth. And the master carpenters at the time relied on those books in order to create the doorways and all of the moldings.
So everything was kind of prescribed.
It was all prescribed, and all based upon Palladian architecture. So the architecture of Williamsburg is dominated by these rather severe buildings. And you look at William and Mary, it's designed by Wren. But
Christopher Wren?
Sir Christopher Wren designed William and Mary. And it's unlike his architecture in England, which is very unadorned as compared to St. Paul's Cathedral and so on and so forth. And it's because in early America there was very little in the way of craftsmanship, and particularly in the landed gentry areas of the Virginians, which were basically farming rather than any other crafts. So there were no masons, there were no real carpenters. And you look at that architecture and you say, well, this is very stiff, but it fits kind of the stiff, rigid Virginia cultural attitude that they had. Very law-abiding, very friendly. The Virginians are called the Cavaliers because a number of them went over to England and fought for the king.
For Charles.
When Cromwell threw the king out. A number of the Virginians went over to defend the king. and so they were called the Cavaliers. The Marylanders, on the other hand, are quite a different group of people, and the state is called the Old Line State because they held the line during the Revolutionary War. But it wasn't until the Revolutionary War that the Marylanders were even convinced to join. Whereas the Virginians at the time, after Paine, were waving the flag for the Revolution.
Oh.
So you look at beyond.
So what was it about the Marylanders' character or way of life that made them so different from the Virginians?
Well, the upbringing was Catholic upbringing. So they were more merchants, traders, and a number of them lawyers.
So their economy was different.
Their economy was quite different than the landed economy. They had plantations, but the landed plantation economy of Virginia was strictly on tobacco and indigo, whereas Maryland was enjoying the profits of the bay. So they were fishermen, they were seamen, and they were traders.
Yeah, they were much more traders than the Virginians would have been because they were planters and they were selling their goods back to England, I guess, right?
Mostly, yes.
Whereas Annapolis was a seaport and a lot of coming and going there.
We had a more of a melting pot culture in Annapolis than in Virginia. As a matter of fact, the Virginians are an interesting lot. You mentioned that. A number of the plantations, and we'll go to the plantations now, they built wharves right at the plantation. So the ship could pull up to the plantation, be offloaded with tobacco, sent back to England without paying the taxes.
Oh, there's an economic influence.
And many of the plantations border the James River and so on, all have piers that run out to the river so that the ships can pull up. The plantations are extraordinarily interesting because they are strictly Georgian-esque plantations and by the book. So we see Westover, which is probably one of the most wonderful, well, it is, in my view, the best example of Georgian architecture in the world.
Oh my.
It is perfectly balanced. It is a beautiful building, a very luxurious building. And they were all based, all these plantation houses were based upon the designs of designs of English palaces.
Oh my.
And they were very much based upon Palladian architecture, which is classical architecture at its peak. So we see Shirley and Gunston Hall. Gunston Hall is an interesting place. If you're ever nearby Washington, you should visit Gunston Hall, because Gunston Hall is one of the most extraordinary pieces of wooden architecture that I've ever seen. And it was designed by a man named William Buckland. And William Buckland came over to America as an indentured servant. He came over as a servant to Thompson.
Mason?
Mason. The Masons are interesting in themselves, but George Mason was the writer of the Virginia Bill of Rights. And he is one of the only members of the Continental Congress, or not the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Congress, who refused to sign.
He didn't sign it?
He didn't sign the Constitution because it didn't have a Bill of Rights in it. It took him a while to get the Bill of Rights. So Gunston Hall.
How is he related to Thompson Mason?
It's his brother.
Okay.
Gunston Hall, what happened was that George Mason hired or got the servant to do the interior of Gunston Hall. It has a Chinese room that is in the front hall of the building, which just blows your mind. Nothing like it in America. Absolutely spectacular. So that brings us to the Annapolis architecture, which I found quite fascinating because, contrary to the Virginians, the houses in Annapolis are really quirky, and they deviate from what is in the books, and they are quite fascinating in that they stand off by themselves. So the little deviations from the standard Georgian house set them apart. And the reason they are set apart is because the people of Annapolis, being traders and merchants and lawyers, are nouveau riche as opposed to the Virginians. They comprise a class of people who decide that they want to put their mark on the earth, as opposed to the Virginians who just want to look like all the rest of the Virginians.
That's interesting. So these nouveau riche, newly successful people, based on the way they make their living, A, want to put their mark on the world, and B, think outside the box. In order to have made a living, they have done something different than the way the Virginians were making a living.
As opposed to the Virginians, who are landed gentry and planting mostly tobacco and indigo, in particular in the pre-revolutionary times.
Yeah.
There was very little cotton in Virginia. The climate couldn't support it, but it certainly supported tobacco,
which was a relatively new product, and indigo had a huge world market, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it was very precious, and so the climate was able to support the indigo production. Maryland, the climate is a little bit different in that it is able to support more farming and vegetables and that sort of stuff.
And animals?
And animals, but mostly it was known for its vegetable production, corn.
I still love to buy my produce in Maryland.
Absolutely. And so they were traders. So they became traders because they were kind of imitating the Indians. The Indians traded all up and down the Chesapeake, all the way up to the Susquehanna River into New York. Huh. The Maryland Indians were all over the northern part of the United States because of the trading. And when the settlers got to America and got to particularly Maryland, they saw all this trade and said, there's money to be made here. So they sent all of that produce that they were growing up to the north. So much of the produce that we eat in Pennsylvania actually comes from Maryland, or did back then. So I found the cultures of the two societies quite different and quite interesting, in that the people from Maryland and Annapolis, in particular, were willing to tolerate the quirky houses and challenged the architects to create quirky houses. So you'll see Paca.
Yeah, tell us about the houses.
The Paca house is just an interesting house because it is not the basic Georgian plan. It has things sticking out of it, for one. The Georgian plan is a box, and it's a 5-part scheme. You have the center hall, you have the front salon, the back salon, maybe a library, maybe a bedroom. There are 5 rooms on the ground floor of the Georgian house, and it's put in a box. And the upper floor is almost identical. Now, what happens in the Annapolis houses is they begin to deviate from that plan. And in fact, in the Rideout House, which is one of the most fascinating buildings in Annapolis today, they split the whole facade with a window that thrusts through the entire facade into the roof.
Oh my goodness.
And they split the building in half.
This was in the 1700s.
In the 1700s. I asked Bob Venturi if he had ever seen that house because his mother's house splits the house in half. And he said, oh no, I've never seen that house. The Jennings Bryant house has a little Palladian window on the second floor above the entrance with a little railing that is made for a midget. and the scale is completely out of scale. And ultimately...
So it's really just there for ornament, right?
Absolutely ornament. William Buckland ultimately ended up coming to Annapolis.
Remind us about who William Buckland
was. He was the master builder, carpenter of Gunston Hall.
Oh,
and
oh yeah, you told me previously that he had a very interesting life.
Well, he was an indentured servant. He was a gambler.
Okay.
He died mysteriously on the Eastern Shore. They think over a gambling argument.
At a very young age.
At age about 40.
Okay.
He did 2 houses in Annapolis. One is the Chase Lloyd house, which is the biggest house in Annapolis, aside from Bladens Folly. They were for lawyers. And the Hammond Harwood house. Now the building, the Chase Lloyd house, is extremely large and has a fabulous Palladian window on the side of the house, or the back of the house where the staircase goes up. And if you look at that in contrast to the severe front entry of the Williamsburg house, you'll see the craftsmanship that went into making that window. And that's all throughout Annapolis. And what's fascinating about Annapolis is, aside from being traders and merchants, the people of Annapolis were shipbuilders.
Oh.
Because a great deal of their revenue came from the bay.
So they had the carpentry skills.
So they had the carpentry skills that Virginia did not have.
Because ships,
they were farmers.
Ships are made with such precision and such refinement.
The shipbuilders built the ships during the wintertime, sent them out to sea, and then they built the houses during the summertime.
Ah.
And they were able to create entrances that were garnished and quite elaborate. The entrance to the Hammond Harwood house is called the finest entry in America. It's an incredible doorway. Absolutely striking. So the people of Annapolis, the newly wealthy, were able to utilize the skills of the carpenters and create the designs of their houses based upon those skills. Now, Buckland is an interesting guy because he begins to break the mold and deviate from what is in the pattern books.
Okay.
In the main hall of the Chase Lloyd house are shutters with a rope molding on the shutter, and that celebrates Annapolis, the shipbuilding sailing town.
Yes, yes.
And there's no such thing like that
Not in the
any
pattern
of
books.
the pattern books that the British ever created.
Or in any of the plantations in
Or
Virginia.
in any of the plantations that we've ever seen. The Hammond Harwood house, what he does there is he drops the eaves line of the house in the middle, like it's sunk. And I think he's doing it as a hiccup that says, I'm different than anybody else.
This is the roof line?
Yeah, the whole roof line drops down in the front of the house. So it became really fascinating to look at the cultures of both Virginia and Annapolis, and that set the tone for the book, The Groundbreakers, because When I retired from practice, I decided that I would make the theme of the Annapolis lecture an actual history of American architecture theme.
Oh.
And look at the culture, the politics, the economics, and so forth that created the architecture of all our cities and towns in America.
Okay, so the lecture that you gave in Annapolis many years ago became the core of the book, and you spent the first part of your retirement expanding on that
Well,
theme.
the lecture, when I gave it, was attended by a colleague of mine named Michael Dennis, who wrote the foreword to the book, or he wrote a critique of the book. And he was at the lecture, and he came up to me and he said, "That's the best lecture I've ever heard on the beginnings of American architecture." He said, "The good news is it took me 10 years to get my book written. You have a book, but it took me 10 years to get mine written." Well, 30 years later, my book finally came out.
That's because you were busy practicing all those years.
That's right. So we come to Thomas Jefferson, who obviously is a Virginia. He is the only American president that was an architect. Jefferson is the Virginia architect. He builds his plantation at Monticello. And what Jefferson did, interestingly enough, in my opinion, and what sets the tone for the book, is that Jefferson, because of his architecture and Monticello and the University of Virginia and the Richmond Capitol building, because of that architecture, he stifled American creativity for about 60 years.
Because as I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware of, Jefferson's architecture was just so perfect, so perfectly
Crafted.
Perfectly crafted, perfectly balanced, perfectly symmetrical, and perfectly based on those pattern books that you referred to.
Yes, the Jeffersonian architecture, what Jefferson was really interested in doing was creating an American architectural statement that would represent what we thought was our republic.
Oh, that's right. He was founding a country now. He just wasn't being a plantation owner.
Right. So he wanted to create an architecture for the country.
Okay.
And that architecture would declare our Republican sense through its formality and so on and so forth. And so he emulated Roman Republican architecture, or what he thought was Roman Republican architecture. So he based his buildings on the buildings that he thought were Roman Republican buildings.
Well, they were Roman.
They were Roman, but they really were, what we find is that it's the only mistake that I know that Jefferson ever made, was that he emulated empire buildings, not...
From the imperial period instead of the Republican period. Right. But they were Roman anyway.
Right.
And they were perfect.
The University of Virginia is a three-quarter scale of the Pantheon.
Oh my goodness.
And he absolutely copied the Pantheon completely. And Pantheon happened to be built during Hadrian's reign, not in the Republic. But he created an architecture that was impeccable, and that's why I say that he stifled American creativity for about 60 years.
Because?
No one wanted to deviate from the Jefferson mold of architecture.
Because everything, now, we in Philadelphia have a magnificent stock of architecture from our early statehood. Haviland and all of those architects, I can't think of others right now, you would be able to name them, I'm sure, did gorgeous neoclassical architecture.
Thomas U. Walter did the Capitol of the United States, the Capitol building, did the first Bank of the United States in Philadelphia.
Oh, I love that building.
And
the second bank I love.
And the second bank. And so he essentially emulated Thomas Jefferson.
So Jefferson really did, you say stifle, he really did set a standard for all architects to follow for another 40
years.
or 50 or 60 years.
60 years.
Uh-huh.
And it wasn't until the Civil War came along that that model of Jefferson fell apart.
And why was that?
Because the industrial North won the war.
And the industrial North won by being industrial.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
And effectively, Hamilton won the Civil War. Everyone thinks that Lincoln won the Civil War, but Hamilton, who was already dead at the time, won the Civil War because the industrial North, which he championed, and he's the founder of the Bank of the United States, the industrial North was what he championed. And he believed in the industrial North. Jefferson, on the other hand, believed in the idyllic plantation life.
So Jefferson really was a clear product of Virginia, and
Absolutely.
and the industrialists who progressed the country forward through and after the Civil War were more like the Annapolis residents,
Yeah.
thinking
And
independently, nouveau riche, and thinking of new
Outside
ways
of the
to
box.
new ways to solve problems.
So what Jefferson did was unintended consequences. He wanted to really dictate an American style of architecture. What he did was he made the statement, which was a statement that no one else ever made or even thought about at the time. He made the statement that you have the right to pursue happiness.
Okay, yes.
And no one in that time of our civilization ever said you had the right to pursue happiness.
They didn't?
You had the right to pursue your livelihood, and you had the right to pursue survival, but not happiness. Only the royals had the right to pursue happiness. They controlled the happiness.
Well, that's true. Individuals couldn't really be individuals
No.
in a monarchical culture,
You could only have the right to survival.
and you could only do what the king wanted you to do.
Absolutely. So when Jefferson made the statement, you have the right to pursue happiness, he unleashed American creativity.
Uh-huh.
He created the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Gates, the Steve Jobses of the world were all created out of that one statement. Because what you have the right to do now, after Jefferson, is if it doesn't work, fix it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you did was you invented the light bulb. It's dark. Well, basically,
More candles aren't going to do the job.
Jefferson said, fix it. So we got the car, we have the light bulb, we have an incredible wealth of things because of what Jefferson said.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of that French royal who visited here and was so impressed by our entrepreneurialism and our individuality.
Yep.
And he predicted America is thriving and will lead the world based on that ability to think outside the box.
So what that did was it generated an interesting method of pursuing the subjects of the book. Because when I was writing the book, I had a lunch with a history of architecture professor at Bryn Mawr. He looked very askance at me writing a book on the history of architecture because you're just an architect. You don't have a doctorate in.
You're not an academician
in architectural
Okay.
history. He was very
even though you have 3 degrees in architecture and
Right.
and you spent your career not only practicing, but you also taught all the way through your career and taught thesis to graduate students for most
Yep.
of those years.
So what I did was, rather than write a simple architectural history, which oftentimes is based upon the architectural methodology and so on and so forth, and they become very academically based. And I started, in fact, when I did the beginning research looking at the architectural historians, and I would get halfway through the books and say, this is very boring stuff. Mm-hmm. What I did was I set upon myself a goal of writing a popular book on American architecture, a book that would entertain people, and a book that you would pick it up and start looking through it and say, oh, this is kind of interesting stuff. This is more about the history of America than it is about the history of architecture. And it traces throughout the book, it traces where the architect came from, why he came from the place that he did, what happened in that place that would foster the genius of an architect to come to the top, and what were the economic and social political circumstances that allowed this person to arise.
Yes, it's not just a book about the history of architecture and the history of our country, but it's also a book about the history of invention.
Yes.
And so yes, if a certain innovation happens in a certain region, then that region is going to thrive. Right. And because it thrives, it creates a need for a particular industry to blossom. It creates an entrepreneur or a whole class of entrepreneurs meeting those needs, those desires. It creates employment for lots of people, and it creates a demand for an architect or more than one architects to meet demands for architecture that are different than what was built before.
Right. And so going back to the lecture and to the theme that you just stated, I created an architectural heresy in that lecture by pronouncing William Buckland as the first American architect. And any architectural historian would go bananas with that statement, but William Buckland is the first American architect that begins to invent things.
Oh, that's true.
And because he's the first man on the scene, I labeled him the first American architect.
And he was bold enough to break those rules.
He was bold enough to break the rules. His clients were bold enough to ask him to break the rules, and he did. And as a matter of fact, he practically invented the architectural practice because he had a studio of people working on his designs, which was unheard of at the time.
Really?
And so he had a real architectural office.
Huh.
And he didn't call himself an architect because there weren't architects at that time. They were master builders. And he was a master builder carpenter, a carpenter joiner, they called him. So you join things through the wood. Mm. And so they were the people hired to do all of the interiors of these houses back during the time of the Revolution or pre-revolutionary times. But Buckland is the first guy that begins to break those rules.
So he was, what year would he have died? Around
1870.
Oh,
or 1770.
1770. So he was practicing around 1750 and to 70.
Well, in Annapolis, it was in the late, late 60s.
Okay.
When he did those two houses.
Okay.
He only contributed two houses to the palette of Annapolis architecture, but they're extraordinary houses, and
he influenced others.
Well, if you look at the Hammond Harwood house, all the Georgian houses were the 5-part scheme, and then two adjacent buildings. They called them the adjacencies. And one housed the slave quarters and the other housed the kitchen. Dependencies. One was the slaves and the other was the kitchen. Now the dependencies on the Hammond Harwood house have octagonal ends.
Oh, how beautiful.
If you look at the slide of Monticello, the last slide, there are octagonal ends on Monticello. And so it was not Jefferson influencing William Buckland, it was Buckland influencing and Jefferson visited that house and became very enamored of the octagonal ends and incorporated them into Monticello when he finally built it.
Yeah.
And he built it after the Buckland house.
Isn't the cupola octagonal too, or not? Am I right or wrong about that?
No, that's a circular.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but and Jefferson, I labeled the chapter of Jefferson the rational, Thomas Jefferson, the romantic rationalist, because as opposed to being an empiricist, Jefferson was a rationalist.
That's true. He was an empiricist. He was very big into exploring and discovering
No,
things.
he was not. He was the rationalist.
Well, he was both, I'm saying.
Franklin was the empiricist.
Okay.
No, nobody but a rationalist could make the statement that we are endowed with.
No, you're right about that.
These rights. Jefferson was the rationalist, but he was a romantic rationalist because when he did the Monticello, he set that building up to be a model of the quietude of the plantation. And all he wanted was for the government to go away and not bother him. And as I said, Hamilton won the war because the government didn't go away after the Civil War. But anyway, Jefferson was the guy who built this romantic place to go off and live after his presidency. So he was a rationalist, but he was also a romantic rationalist. What we'll see in the next coming episodes is the burgeoning of American architecture after the Civil War, and breaking loose from its neoclassical Jeffersonian style to an architecture that is truly quirky.
Because up until 1860, the change was just very, very gradual. The only change really was in Annapolis, but then...
And it's so subtle.
Right.
When you look at the Annapolis houses, the Hammond Harwood house and the Chase Lloyd house, you look at it and say, there's nothing unusual about that.
Yeah, you would see it because you're an architect, but you needed to explain to our viewers.
They look ho-hum, you know, typical colonial architecture, and yet the change is very subtle, but it's there. And after the Civil War, American creativity was let loose.
That's right.
And it wasn't until after the Civil War that all the inventions started coming. At the same time, quirky architects began to pop up like Frank Furness and H.H. Richardson and these other architects. And you'll see all around the country how these architects pop up in various places and why. And that's what the book covers.
Because the history of the region, or the economics of the region, or the innovation of the region, or the climate of the region, or the politics and culture of the region, any of those things impacted the built environment of that region.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So the architecture becomes very influenced by the various other things that are happening within a particular area. And
so I know that in the book you talk about Philadelphia on several occasions. Philadelphia right after the Civil War, and Philadelphia in the 20th century. You talk about Boston, but you talk about Pasadena and Tulsa and Detroit and San Francisco, Oakland. You talk about almost every region around the country because each one is so unique and each one seems to have blossomed at a different point in time, because mostly because of the invention that took place there, probably.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
It's really fascinating.
Each city and each place that we know in America has a unique moment in time where the city gains enormous wealth, and simultaneous to that, the architect of that period emerges.
Right.
And
so what would happen is a city would blossom, and there'd be a lot of architects meeting the needs, but one would surface
rise
as
to the top.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Right.
So people who have taken a course in college in the history of architecture would hear all of these names, these familiar names that they had access to, but because that was the talented person in that region that surfaced.
Yep.
Unfortunately, in my education, I suspect most people's education, they don't know, they aren't taught what caused that architect to rise to the top or to flourish. They're just taught, this is his architecture. Like for instance, you've just done with almost all the houses that we looked at. I'd say that Buckland was possibly the only architect that you gave the viewer any background on what his life was like. But so all of these houses that we've seen today are similar to each other. They don't stand out from each other.
No.
And therefore, the architect of that house, those houses, are not people that one would have studied in college.
No.
But people probably have, certainly Philadelphians have heard the name.
When I was asked to give the lecture about Annapolis, I knew nothing of William Buckland.
Okay.
And we had a woman in our office who had been head of admissions for St. John's College prior to becoming an architect. St. John's College is in Annapolis.
Okay, I was going to ask that. Okay.
And when I set about doing the research for Annapolis, I told her that I was charged to give a lecture about Annapolis architecture. And she said, you have to meet William Buckland because he is really the architect in Annapolis that really makes a major difference. And so I began to research who this guy was. Now, most of the other architects of that time period, and a little later, like Thomas U. Walter and so on and so forth, most of them were not educated in architecture. Most of them were carpenters, master builders, and very few were educated in architecture.
Oh.
And MIT ended up becoming the first architectural school, and it wasn't until after the Civil War. So prior to the Civil War, the in quote architects were really looked upon as master builders.
They almost came out of the guild tradition from Europe.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until after the Civil War, I believe, that architects began to go to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And Jefferson became an architect because he went to Paris.
The École des Beaux-Arts. No, he didn't.
He did not.
Okay.
He was ambassador to the French
That's right.
court. And he became very intrigued by the architecture and the culture of the French at the time. And he carried that back to America. And so his architecture is based more upon French principles and Roman classicism than American classicism, which is Palladian and Georgian English classicism. So take that as if you will.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was very influenced by the architecture
of Paris.
Paris,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he was a tremendous Francophile.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, he loved France.
He loved French wine, I know.
He and Benjamin Franklin, the two opposites, the empiricist and the rationalist, are all in Paris at the same time.
And loving every minute of it.
And loving every minute of it. So,
Well, we in Philadelphia are certainly lucky to have had Ben Franklin, and all Americans are lucky to have had Thomas Jefferson.
And at the time that I write about, the beginning of American architecture, there is a very loud dialogue going on in Europe about empiricism and rationalism.
That's true.
And the
Age of Enlightenment.
All of the philosophical treatises are about empiricism and rationalism.
Right.
And I'm sure that Jefferson and Franklin were all a part of that argument. What I write about in my book is American invention and American intuitiveness in architecture and its empiricism. The architecture that I write about is not studied. It's off the top of the, as Peter Boland said of me and himself, we just do architecture. And it's true. You do what you enjoy doing.
And the rationalism was left behind at the time, at the Civil War, and empiricism took over from the Civil War on.
And what you have to do as we go through these buildings in the future, and you'll see American architecture, is realize that what I'll show you is architects having a hell of a lot of fun. And really enjoying the breaking of the rules. As Peter Boland once said, you have to know the rules to know how to break them.
So you've mentioned Peter Boland twice.
Yeah.
Who is Peter?
Peter wrote the introduction to my book, was a chairman of the AIA Committee on Design, and a dear friend and fabulous designer.
And the name of his firm is?
Boland Zawadzki Jackson. And he and I became very close through the activities of the Committee on Design.
And the name of your firm was Dagit Jr.
Right.
Dagit Jr. Architects.
So anyway, so you'll see the architects. You can imagine the architects just at the drawing board, having a really good time.
Especially if they're conferring with their partners and their other design team, just having a great time.
A number of these buildings I'll show you are basically buildings where the architect is saying, "See what I can do."
Well, that seems to be what the architects in Annapolis were doing.
Yeah, it worked.
See what I can do.
Yep. Exactly.
And look how I can make this.
As opposed to the Virginia architects. Who
Actually, they probably were too. They were saying, "See how gorgeous a classical building I can create."
Yeah, they were, but I don't think they were having nearly as much fun.
Not as much fun, no.
Because they could, they as opposed to William Buckland, essentially saying, "Look, I pulled this out. I pulled this off."
Pulled this off, right.
The architects in Virginia were simply saying it's a very beautiful thing, but it's formulaic.
You know what I'm just remembering? There's an element in the design process that we haven't talked about, but what we're saying is true of that too, and that's the client. The client in Annapolis wanted something that suited his needs, not that was restricted by the pattern books, but rather suited his needs, and that's certainly something that I know happened in the Industrial Revolution, that a neoclassical factory doesn't work.
No.
You need to design something.
Exactly.
Form follows function. Start with the function.
Exactly.
Right. So the client was having fun as well as the architect.
Yep.
Is there anything else about Virginia, Maryland, Williamsburg, Annapolis that we should make sure to let the audience know about?
I would only suggest that if you have a chance to go down there and see some of the stuff that's fantastic to go through. One of the stunning things about the Annapolis architecture is the interior colors. The colors of the rooms are vibrant greens and blues, and they are so striking it almost makes your eyes hurt.
Yeah, who would imagine that when you're thinking about neoclassical architecture or classical architecture?
They painted the inside of those houses with incredible color.
Huh.
And I'm not so sure it wasn't simply because they were inventing color back then.
That's true. They were experimenting.
They were experimenting, and so they decided to experiment with the colors in the rooms of those houses. But if you take a tour through the houses of Annapolis, you'll find that to be true in just about every single one of them. And it's eye-hurting almost.
Are you able to go inside some of these houses?
Yes, a lot of them you can take tours. Yeah, there are house tours in Annapolis if you go there.
How about Virginia plantations?
No.
No?
Matter of fact, Westover that I showed is still being lived in by the same family.
Oh my goodness.
And you can't get in there. The interiors, there are pictures of some of the interiors. The interiors are not nearly as vibrant as the Annapolis houses, except for for George Mason's house. And George Mason has a green room that is electrifying, to say the least.
Well, he was the one who was thinking outside the box.
He
right.
was the rebel.
He was the one who wouldn't sign
the Constitution
without the Bill of Rights.
Yep.
And who wrote the Bill of Rights for his own.
He wrote the Virginia Bill of Rights.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. His own colony or state, I guess you'd have to say state.
And the rooms, and if you get a chance to get near Washington, it's not very far from Washington, overlooks the Potomac. If you get a chance to see the Gunston Hall, absolutely go see it. It's incredible.
So it would be on the way to Monticello.
Yeah, right.
Or no, Mount Vernon, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And the Chinese room is a revolutionary room. I think there are only one or two installations of Chinese rooms anywhere in the United States.
My goodness.
And the chinois was becoming very fashionable at the time. If you look at Monticello, all of the railings are a Chinese motif.
I was wondering about those railings. Were they also inspired by Buckland or not?
No.
No, but they were inspired by the chinois trend.
Yeah, that was a fad at the time.
Uh-huh.
Chinois. So.
Well, I must say, the history of American architecture that you've covered so far is really fascinating. Who would know?
It truly is. I mean, you don't really pay attention to it because, as you said, Buckland didn't break the rules that much.
Uh-huh.
But when you contrast the two different cultures, you find it quite startling. I mean, here are these rebel Virginians going against the crown, and they were the exact opposite. So, and Maryland didn't want to necessarily join the revolution. They were reluctant to come on board.
I'm struck with how you have defined those two colonies so differently, because I think most of us Americans just think of 13 colonies and think of them as relatively homogeneous.
Yeah.
Now these two, well, I guess perhaps every one had its own personality, and these two very striking right next to each other.
Well, I didn't look at the others because they're much more urban.
Well, I'm afraid we have to call this quits right now. But I will tell the audience to please join us again next time when we'll focus, I'm happy to say, on Philadelphia and Boston. We'll see how, coming out of the Civil War, two geniuses, Frank Furness in Philadelphia and H.H. Richardson in Boston, veered American architecture away from that antebellum classical route and took it in their entirely unprecedented and downright quirky new directions. We'll see you then.